Welcome, dear students of fourth year. This year we're going to study modern and contemporary drama. So our course is divided into two sections, modern drama and contemporary drama. And we are going to have at least one representative work which belongs to the modern age, what we call in English literature modernism, and another work, another play that represents contemporary drama or recent drama. So we are going to have at least two works, two plays. But first of all, we're going to have a general definition of modernism and a general idea of the major principles and techniques of modern drama in general. And then we're going to have a kind of analysis of one of the major movements in this period of literary history, modernism. This movement is called absurd drama or theater of the absurd. As for the second section of our course, which is contemporary drama, we are going to concentrate on African American drama, a movement in America called African American drama. And for that, we are going to study one of the most important contemporary dramas in the history of the entire United States, in the history of the entire American literary canon, which is Gem of the Ocean, written by the great American dramatist, African American dramatist, August Wilson. So we're going to have, at least as I told you, two texts. A modern text entitled The Room by Harold Pinter. Harold Pinter is an absurd drama writer of absurd drama. And the second text we're going to have as a representative of contemporary drama is August Wilson's Gem of the Ocean. But first, let's have an idea, a definition of this literary movement of the 20th century called modernism. Modernism is simply said to be modern literary practices or modern literary writings. It is the principles, it represents this movement, modernism, represents the principles of a literary school that lasted from roughly the beginning of the 20th century until the end of the Second World War. Modernism is defined by its rejection of the literary conventions of the 19th century and by its opposition to conventional morality, taste, traditions, and economic values of the preceding century. In the modern age, or the beginning of the 20th century, we find that there is an increasing sense among people that life is overwhelmingly confusing and complicated. In the late 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, for example, in the novels of Thomas Hardy, Joseph Conrad, James Joyce, Virginia Woolf, and D.H. Lawrence, and in the poetry of T.S. Eliot and William Butler Yeats, we find that there is a feeling that the world has become so baffling, so confusing, that it's impossible to make sense of it, particularly as the decline, and in many cases, the total eclipse, the decline of religious faith, religious beliefs, which robs writers of any secure perspective or framework of shared values from which they can interpret and make sense of experience. The central historical event of the early 20th century is, of course, the First World War, which lasted from 1914 to 1918. It was a war so terrifying and tragic that it seems to sum up well that is closer to chaos than to any sane order, to sanity. Yet, the early 20th century is a period of extraordinary creativity in all parts or all types of arts, not only in poetry and the novel or drama, but also in music, painting, sculpture, and so on. Even drama is revitalized after many years of stagnation, as you remember, in the 19th century. What this points to, again, is the fact that rapid social change almost always stimulates the production of a great art. The text which perhaps best exemplifies this age, the modern age, the best representative of the spirit of the modern age, this spirit of uncertainty, ambiguity, is T.S. Eliot's great poem, The Wasteland, written in 1922, which presents to the reader a vision, indeed a black vision, a vision of a fractured society, where the poet can find no order or consolation whatsoever. As with so many works of the period, this work, T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland, is innovative and experimental in form and technique. It seems to be built out of fragments of society, out of fragments of all the arts, fragments of poetry. And this reflects a world where the artist can no longer impose confident and comprehensive control over the facts he encounters in life. So, the term that is often applied to this formally innovative work of the period and many others of the same style is modernist literature. So, modernist works such as Eliot's, Woolf's, Joyce's, and others are often difficult to read. These works are often difficult to read because they reflect the ambiguity and uncertainty of the society, of the people's attitudes and thoughts. So these works are often very difficult to read or interpret, but they become less difficult if we see that the difficulty simply enacts the problems the artist is having himself in making sense of this world at that time. I'd like also to add that modernist literature is characterized by a rejection of 19th century traditions and of their consensus between author on one part and the reader on the other. The conventions of, for example, realism were abandoned by this great novelist known as Franz Kafka and other novelists as well, and by expressionist drama. Not only realist drama, but expressionist drama at the early part of the 20th century. While several poets rejected traditional meters in favor of free verse. So in the 19th century, we find poets rejecting metrical poems or metrical lines, a poem with meter, tradition of meter, in favor of free verse. Instead, they used free verse. Modernist writers tended to see themselves as an avant-garde, a new tradition. Avant-garde means here a new tradition, a new bulk of studies that disengages itself from the traditional values of the 19th century and disturbs or disrupts, indeed both, the readers by adopting complex and difficult new forms and styles that haven't existed before. In fiction, for example, the accepted continuity of chronological development was disrupted by Joseph Conrad and William Faulkner, for instance, while James Joyce and Virginia Woolf, the other two great novelists of the modernist era, they attempted new ways of tracing the flow of characters' thoughts and their narratological meaning, which is the stream of consciousness, or what we call the stream of consciousness technique. In poetry, Ezra Pound and T.S. Eliot replaced the logical exposition of thoughts with collages. Collage, C-O-L-L-A-G-E. Try to find or locate the meaning of collage in the dictionary. It's very important. So they replaced that traditional logical exposition of thoughts with collages of fragmentary images and complex allusions. In the theater, Bertolt Brecht opened up the theater to new forms of abstraction. He used an abstract theater, the idea of having the action performed on an abstract theater with no setting, with no specific setting or specific plot or specific characters, but all of these are randomly chosen. In place, of course, instead of realist and naturalist representation of the 19th century. Modernist writing, thus, often expresses a sense of, collateral dislocation, what we call collateral dislocation, along with a new awareness of new psychological theories, because at the beginning of the 20th century, different psychological theories began to appear at the hands of Carl Jung and Sigmund Freud. And so these theories of psychology influenced greatly the production and criticism of literary works. Its favored techniques of juxtaposition and multiple point of views being presented on the stage. All of these challenge the reader to re-establish a coherence of meaning, a harmonious series of meanings that he extracts from the text or from the production of the play on the stage. Because, the images being presented on the stage are fragmentary, not related. Now let's move to talk about absurd theater, or theater of the absurd. Theater of the absurd is one of the offsprings of the modernist literature, or the modernist literary movement. The term theater of the absurd applies to the works of certain key writers of the 1950s and early 1960s. Unlike those writers working in realism, for example, or symbolism or expressionism of the 19th century, The writers of the absurd theater were not part of a conscious or deliberate movement. Absurdity or absurd theater wasn't a movement being followed by certain writers or critics or literary writers, but no, they weren't a group under one major umbrella to rebel against earlier conventions. No, because as you know, the Romantics, for example, in the 18th century rebelled against the classics, okay? And the Realists rebelled against the Romantics. And in the 20th century, or the modern age, the Modernists revolted against the traditions and conventions of the Realists. But writers of absurd theater or absurd drama, they didn't rebel against earlier conventions. No. Rather, they were expressing in their own ways a view of life that they all shared. They experienced the same situations of life at this critical period of the world's modern history. What is this view of life? It is a sense that the universe is cold, hostile, and irrational, anarchic, and that humankind's position in this world is helpless, comic, futile, and even absurd. And so this word came to be applied to this theater, absurd theater or theater of the absurd. Among these writers of the theater of the absurd, and the most important of all, Eugene Ionesco, Samuel Beckett, and Harold Pinter. And we can add Edward Albee in America. Those writers hadn't no specific agenda or ideology to be adopted by them. They were overwhelmed by feelings of helplessness and terror that come from living in a world devoid of rational meaning or rationality. The purpose of writing for them, therefore, is simply of expressing their despair and perhaps to share it with other people, with other nations, to find, in a sense, to find comfort in knowing that they are not alone, in realizing that they are completely alone. Another important point is that writers of the theater of the absurd ask, how comprehensible is the world? How far can we understand this world? At first glance, an absurdist play is somewhat like an expressionist play. We have two movements, one preceding the other, expressionism and absurdism or absurd theater. Both agree on some facts and disagree in others. First, the series of events doesn't seem to have a clear meaning. They agree on the fact that the method of writing an expressionist play agrees with the method of writing an absurdist play in that the series of events doesn't seem to have a clear meaning. For example, in Eugene Ionesco's The Bald Soprano, in that play, a group of people sit around conversing or talking to each other. And most of what they say appears to be nonsense. One couple spends about 5 minutes trying to discover where they have seen each other before and are amazed to realize they both live in the same house, under the same room, and share the same bedroom even, and have the same children, and therefore, my God, they must be married, and still they don't know each other. How horrific is this picture? Another example taken from the same play is that of a fireman who comes in trying to determine whether there's a fire in the house or not. Since he's been sent to extinguish all the fires in the city, they debate whether or not that glowing thing in the fireplace is or is not a fire. How satiric, how ironic. In the third scene, there's a maid. That maid enters and recites a poem. The characters began to quote proverbs at each other and to babble ever-increasing nonsense, to exchange gossip. And then the lights go off. They come up again, and the play starts all over. The last moment exactly replicates or echoes the first one. So it has no end. And this is a very catastrophic, very gloomy picture of human life at the time. If this were an expressionist play, if this is the situation in such plays which belong to this movement called expressionism, in case it is true, we would first try to identify the main character through whose mind we as audiences are watching the play. We would ask, for example, is he insane? What has repressed him? What has repressed him? Is he only dreaming? Is that a dream from his own imagination? Once we had that key, once we know the truth, we could hopefully imagine that kind of madness, and the world would be comprehensible, would be understood. However, in the absurd play, in plays that belong to absurd theater, there is no such clue. We have no clues that lead us to know or to discover that this is a mere imagination of the actor or the major character. Our lens or eyes are not distorted. Our perceptions are not wrong. The world is exactly as insane as it appears to be. It is not imagination. It is not an illusion. No, it's real. In absurd theater, it is just real. And this is the element of reality or realism in such plays. It's horrific to know that it is not an imagined setting in an imagined situation by imagined characters or unrealistic characters. No, it is just real. The madness is not, therefore, subjective. No, it's objective. It happens. It is there. The writers of the absurd theater also pose that question, which is, how is the plot constructed? Because you know that the traditional type of plot structure consists of an exposition, inciting action, rising action, complication, followed by the climax at the top, and then we have the falling action, and at last the denouement or catastrophe. But is there traditional type of plot structure that can be followed in theater of the absurd? No. In the theater of the absurd, plot is of less concern than is mood. The most important part that theater of the absurd tries to communicate to the reader is the mood of the characters, the mood of life at that time or that period. We don't have a linear plot structure. We have a non-linear plot. We have separate, isolated, unconnected series of events that take place on the stage with no connection, with no logical connection, because remember that plot is a logical sequence of events in a play or any work of art. After all, how can there be a plot in an absurd world? Could it be? Plot is, by definition, is a selection and arrangement of events that take place together, are related, and they add something to each other. The parts add something to each other. They are complementary. But the absurdists or absurd theater writers claim there is neither meaning nor connection. Thus, the very idea of a linear khatti, what we call in Arabic khatti, the very idea of a linear narrative is useless. A linear plot is useless, is futile. It doesn't exist. Therefore, the plays are often a series of extremely, episodic from episode, episodic, random, disconnected scenes or images. However, there are some exceptions. Events might seem to follow other events with some sense of causality, as-sababiyya, causality. Sometimes we have causality, okay? But, this causality is deceptive. It is not real. We are often led to anticipate a particular ending, a particular action to happen at the end. We might well assume that certain expectations will be satisfied or met at the end, but we are almost always proven to be wrong. A third question posed by absurd writer or absurd writers: what is the substance or the texture of the characters? What type of characters do we have in an absurd play? Characters in an absurd play share many of the same characteristics as those who are found in expressionistic plays. They rarely look, sound, or behave like real people in our lives. This is very important. Pay attention. Characters in an absurd play rarely look or sound or behave like real people in our lives. They are often represented as abstract qualities or ideas brought to life on the stage. Thus, characters often don't have names, but simply what we call designations. Designations, like, for example, mommy, daddy, Mr. and Mrs. Smith, Mr. and Mrs. Johns, and so on. We don't have separate identity for each character. We don't have names, but abstractions of names. Some plays, however, do make some attempt to give their characters individual personalities or identities. Like in Waiting for Godot by Samuel Beckett. We find only two characters as the major characters performing that play. We have about three other characters, but of less important. The action concentrates on these two. These two characters are distinct people with unique names. They have names. They are Vladimir and Estragon. Vladimir and Estragon. One, one of them emerges to us or appears to be a leader, and the other as a follower, a superior and an inferior, a master and a servant. However, in such plays, these characters become almost expressionistic. So, what do I mean by expressionistic in that case? Expressionistic characters. That is, they are victims of objects, victims of circumstances, victims of bullies, other people who bully them, or simply victims of a walid that doesn't care. As for the setting in absurd theater, we have already noted that the setting and the time and place of the events. In absurd theater, geography has little meaning in an absurd universe. If an absurd play reflects the situation or the conditions of people in an absurd environment, so the geography or the place is of less importance. Therefore, locations can be vague and unspecific, unidentified. Usually we don't have apparent or clear settings. In this respect, absurdist settings are like symbolist settings. They provide hints about the world behind appearances. This is very important. The settings or absurd plays with no settings, of course, in this way they provide hints about a world behind appearances, or the real world, not the superficial world. We call this the world behind the curtain. The world behind the curtain. And this world is illogical, irrational, and overwhelming. Some settings clearly reflect this point of view. In Waiting for Godot again, the two tramps, the two major characters in this play, are in a large open field. A large open field. That field is bare, except for a single tree, under which they remain for the entire play. In other plays, the setting comments ironically on the supposed symbolism of the place. There are also plays in which the playwright dispenses with the illusion of setting completely and sets the play in the theater itself. So sometimes the writer discards, gets rid of in any settings that are valid to be included in the play. We don't have any setting, except of course the theater itself, the stage. This is the case, for example, in one of Edward Albee's famous dramas called The Sandbox. The Sandbox. In this play, we are constantly reminded that we are in a playhouse, in a theater, on a stage. How does he manage to do that? The characters refer to the wings. One of the characters is clearly an actor playing a role, and Grandma even addresses the audience. In any case, the absurdist setting reinforces the convention that the universe is cold, bare, and void. No matter where you are, really you are not at anywhere. As for the language used, Most often, the language in an absurdist play is similar to the language used in realist plays, in that we find people speak in recognizable sentences using conventional syntax and grammar, and the playwright has made use of both literal and connotative meanings. So occasionally, absurdist dialogue in absurdist plays shares some features with realist plays, in that they concentrate on the mood of the characters. Finally, it remains to say that for the writers who use absurdist techniques, the world is incoherent, illogical, non-linear, and irrational. The traditional laws of cause and effect do not operate, are not functional in absurd theater. Language ceases to have inherent meaning. Numbers and places are only arbitrary, random, and it all winds up being so horrible. The picture is so horrible. You can only survive by laughing at the absurdity of trying to find meaning where there is no meaning at all. Thank you, and see you next lecture, inshallah.